Points. People want points in Warhammer 40,000 to change often, and people want points to stay the same for longer. I know these are different people, but I see you all as a sort of amorphous blob of contradictory opinions. Unless you are a channel member or Ko-Fi member, then I know who you are and you are a person. The higher tiers get their name at the end of the video. There have been three main ways that points are presented to us in Warhammer 40,000 to make our army lists. I'm going to explore the pros and cons of each, starting with how the points are right now in 10th edition. But that may not be the way points options are presented in the rest of 10th edition. Games Workshop may be going to change points to be more granular, to have points for each weapon, or only some of the weapons. It may be a change in 11th edition or in a coming balance patch. When discussing the changes to balance patches, that they were going to do them every 3 months instead of every 6 months, it was mentioned on Warhammer Plus, the idea of some weapons being costed was floated as a concept, a returning concept. Rather than one fixed cost for each unit, there would be a unit cost and then some weapon options currently available to the unit would cost additional points if you chose them. Will this finally balance Warhammer 40,000? I'm sorry, I almost got through the line that time with a straight face. I tried. That was the best take. It will never be balanced. We want options that represent the weapons of the lore and give meaningful choices over which weapons you take. Flat points per unit as it is now would be okay if each weapon option was about equal in power. But a heavy bolter is not better at killing Chaos Marines than a multi-melter. And a multi-melter performs great against light vehicles, which a heavy bolter struggles to hurt. Points are also fixed for the unit sizes. If you have a unit of 11 termagants because you picked up a free Games Workshop model of the month, you pay the same cost for a unit of 20. So you always leave one model behind to pay the cost for 10. Some version of points per model could return. If you are new to 10th edition or haven't played it, here is how it works before we explore the pros and cons of this system. Points per unit is locked sizes as sold in boxes. So 10 Orc Boys are set points. 2 boxes to make 20 Orc Boys are a different set of points. That is the only points value you need to care about. If you have shooters or a big chopper on the knob or a power claw on the knob, it doesn't matter, it is the same points just depending on whether there's 10 orcs or 20 orcs. The only other options for points are some enhancements to go on your characters. They're a small number of points which can get you up to the correct number of points or as close as possible to the maximum number of points you are playing. 1,000 points, 1,500 points, 2,000 points, whatever it is. For newer players, this may be all you know. So we'll look at the pros and cons of using the points this way before we look at other ones. This way of doing it is sometimes called power-like points because of older editions. In 8th and 9th edition, there were 2 ways of making army lists. One with points values for each squad, each weapon, each upgrade, and the other was a fixed power, one set value, like 3 power points for a squad of 10 regardless of equipment, and 6 points for a unit of 20. That was a quick way of getting an army together and didn't care what weapons you picked. It was all the same power. 10th edition is like that. But then the points have a big issue. The weapons have varying power to match the lore. A plasma pistol is more powerful than a bolt pistol, but they're going to cost the same points. You could change a plasma pistol to only have one fire mode and always be hazardous, then the choice is more meaningful. There is a risk to the plasma, but what about a las pistol compared to a bolt pistol? A bolt pistol has to have more stopping power than a las pistol because of the lore that the tabletop game is trying to portray. Let's start with the pros. And yeah, it's kind of a bit PowerPoint style. It's not that you do one collab with Auspex Tactics and suddenly everything's PowerPoint, but PowerPoints have some value. Quickly portraying information is one of them. So one of the benefits of this way of doing the points, it's really quick to make an army list. You can worry about the weapons later. You can just pick up the weapons that are on the model. You don't need to think, okay, I have this unit. Oh, but if I have a heavy bolter and the superior has a power weapon, then it's going to cost me more than the base number of points. So I need to factor that in before I calculate the next unit. You just add all the numbers together. It's pretty quick. So it's easy for beginners. You don't need to ask before you build a unit, what is this Tau gun? What is this other Tau gun? How is the flamer looking bit different to the plasma rifle bit? You can build the units with whatever weapons looks cool to you, and the points will be the same regardless. The amount of damage they can output is going to be about the same. Not perfectly the same, but we don't want people to worry about balance too much. It shouldn't be an obsession. Even though it kind of sort of is when you're making a PowerPoint about how they can make the points better. But all you need to worry about is building the models so that they reflect the weapons in the box, which should be the weapons that the rules let you take. With this points as power style, you don't need to have your models in front of you when you make the army list. You could make the army list at work, knowing, yeah, I've got some Battle Sisters, I can't remember if they've got Storm Bolters or Flamers or whatever. I can decide a bit later on what they're going to have. I can look in the box later. I'll make the army list now, ready for that night. I used to do that a lot, make the army list during the day for the gaming on the evening. If there was points per every single weapon, that may not reflect the lore, which is then punishing you for being lore accurate. You get the cool lore accurate weapons in lore accurate units. Tactical squads don't run all bolters when they're designed for a range of weapons and a flexible approach to combat. You don't have to pay points for the sergeant to have a power fist if you prefer that over a power sword. You don't need to pay for a melter gun or a plasma cannon. You get them in the points cost. You can have the cool weapons regardless. And it's lore accurate, which is often the thing that gets a lot of people into 40k. There is still a way to balance weapons around these 2 points levels. You could have different costs for the first 5 models in a squad compared to the second 5. If the best guns are available regardless of unit size, the minimum size can cost more points per model than the maximum unit size. The Death Corps of Kree Grenadiers are the most obvious example. In the middle, neither a pro nor a con, because it can go either way very much depending on how you feel. Splitting apart datasheets. What once was one unit that you buy in a box now makes multiple different units with different rules. So there are 2 kinds of acolytes built out of the acolyte box, and also metamorphs. There are 4 different unit cards representing Tau Crisis battlesuits. There are loads of kinds of Lehman Russ tanks. It does break the rule of 3 of only one thing, because you can only have 3 of any unit card, but that means you can have 3 Lehman Russ Punishers, 3 Lehman Russ Vanquishers, 3 Battle Tanks. And that's going to be a perfectly fine army. Not a fun army to play against if you haven't got a million anti-tank weapons, but a valid army. It then lets each version of the tank or unit have a unit rule guided to their speciality. The Vanquisher Cannon is better at taking out enemy tanks and monsters, which would not be suitable as a unit rule for the Lehman Russ with the Punisher Gatling Cannon. Do we try and break up units even more? How much do you change them? You could have an absurd number of units. But it doesn't always work. There are shooting and combat cultists, but they have the same special rule and the same points, but the Chaos Cultists with ranged weapons are better. Do you have Dominions with Flamers as separate units to Dominions with Melter Guns? If you've built your unit with a mix of the 2, are you out of luck and running an invalid unit now? Or is there a third mixed Dominions unit with their own special rule? The drawbacks to having points like power this way: Power Level version 2, as we'll call it, that was very unpopular with the community at the start of 10th edition, including with me, and I am all sunshine and happiness. Maybe not sunshine, because vampire, but positivity. There's a link up there if you want to see what I said about power level, power points for this edition when it first came out. Power level was rarely used by players in 8th and 9th edition, even in Crusade where balance is cared about a bit less. Points were used, they were seen as fairer. So when 10th edition launched with points but really power, and no weapon cost despite different profiles, people were not happy. Everything costs the same, but is clearly not the same. Some guns are better. You might argue that maybe the heavy bolter is about the same as a multi-melter because it has an extra attack and twice the range. More obvious with other weapons is the guard sergeant with a las pistol and a chainsword, or a power weapon and a plasma pistol. Even though you have to remember that rules will change, conventions on points will change, there is still a worry that you built it wrong, or at least suboptimally. On a physical model you glued and painted and it would be an effort to change. Your squad with las weapons is not as good as a squad with plasma weapons that are the same points on the same unit card, and you can't get away from that. So this style of rule only works if all weapon options are the same in level, and we know that they aren't. The D-cannon weapon platforms were the best choice in the Eldar Index, and you are heavily overpaying for a vibro cannon option. That has sort of been fixed by the 3 different weapons being split up and given their own datasheet in the Eldar Codex. But that is the most stark example of how it could happen with any datasheet. One weapon is so much better than the others, but the points are going to be a rough average or closer to the highest one, which means taking the others is just giving yourself a penalty. This is the same system they use in Age of Sigmar, but there aren't many weapon options for units, so it makes little difference there. In 40k, there could be a range of weapon options. We see it on the Death Corps of Krieg, we see it on the Chaos Legionaries. These are basic troops, and there are so many options they could take. Because they also have kill teams, so they have a range of weapons in that. When there is a lot of options available, if you haven't taken all of the good options, or even all the options that are there, you are missing out. If your Leman Russ doesn't have sponsors and a hunter-killer missile and a heavy stubber, you are vastly underpowered for your points cost. But that may be the Leman Russ you got, second-hand, or because you built it some years ago, and you don't have the sponsons and the missiles and any turret-mounted weapons. But taking everything, every time, takes a long time to roll. There are already a lot of dice rolls in 10th edition. So if you're firing the hull gun, firing the side guns, firing a missile, firing the turret gun, firing the pintle-mounted gun, they have to hit and wound, and then there's armor saves and feel no pain saves, and that is one unit done. Then you move on to the next tank, and it repeats. With points level this way, you can't get that close to the optimal level. So if you want 2,000 points, you might end up with 1,980 points. And there's no easy way to get up to that level, because enhancements may not be available for the number of characters you have, or you already have the ones that cost 20 points or less, so you feel you are missing out on value in some way. These are the drawbacks we need to deal with this style of points. Going back into the past of 40k, a place where I reside mentally quite a lot of the time, most of the editions of 40k have worked on having different points for different weapons until 10th edition came along. Everything cost points. Each model cost points, and you could make a unit from the minimum to the maximum size. There were reasons to take the maximum. Some weapons only unlocked if you had a unit of 10 models in the squad. We still see that. If you had 10 points spare after making your list, you could turn a unit of 5 into a unit of 6. This is how Warhammer Fantasy used to work and is how the old world works now. But in 40k it could go deeper. There may be points for having frag grenades or crack grenades or both. Each kind of weapon, whether it's a power fist or power sword, would cost points. The weapons for the sergeants and squad leaders would cost points. The special weapons and heavy weapons could cost points. Any kind of war gear upgrade would cost points. However you have got your unit, there will be a points cost associated with every part of it. So you could run a bare bones version if you wanted. If you only started playing in 10th edition, the best example of how it used to work is the Crisis battlesuits. That'll explain the contrast. The Fire Knife battlesuits have locked equipment and a couple of similar weapon options. That is pretty standard for 10th edition. The other way is the plain Crisis battlesuits from the Index and now Legends. Dozens of options per model, a range of equipment, and a quickly developing meta of as many cyclic ion blasters as you can fit. If that seems grim, there were a lot of good sides to this style of points. Weapons that were not side grades, like a heavy flamer or a heavy bolter, are about the same. They're good at different things. Heavy flamers auto-hit and ignore cover, but heavy bolters have longer range and higher damage. Heavy flamers may get more shots than a heavy bolter, but it's random in the number of shots you get. The heavy flamer takes out light infantry, the other takes out heavy infantry. So a heavy bolter and heavy flamer may have the exact same points, but a multi-melter costs more points because it is going to be better than a heavy bolter, especially on the tables we are seeing in 10th edition with a lot of terrain, which is the encouraged way to have tables in 10th edition. This isn't the open fields with a river and one wood and maybe a little village that we saw from 2nd edition. If your squad has options like a Battle Sister squad can have 2 flamers, or a flamer and a heavy flamer. The heavy flamer is plainly better, so it can cost a few more points. And this can be really granular. We see in 10th edition that all of the points are multiples of 5s. But with much more granular points, you could do 1 point for a bolt pistol instead of a las pistol, or 5 points for a plasma pistol instead of a las pistol. You can have unit sizes that are between the minimum and the maximum, like 12 orc boys to perfectly fit transport spaces that a max size squad of 20 wouldn't fit, and then you pay for 12 orc boys, not for 20 orc boys. I mean, pay points. You still have to buy the models. If there's some weapons that you're like, oh, I didn't fire them and I keep forgetting them and I feel like I'm underpowered because I should be firing those weapons all the time and I'm just not, you can skip them if they cost points that you don't want to pay. Weapons like the grenade launchers on the intercessors, they are so often forgotten. When it comes to making your final points, if you are 5 points over and you have everything you want, you can drop some war gear and keep the units you like. If you are a few points under, a few hunter-killer missiles fixes that. I encourage you to make your hunter-killer missiles detachable with magnets so you can have them or not, and when they've been fired you can take them off to remember. Really detailed points gives more levers and dials for Games Workshop to alter points and balance a unit. If there was a particular combo of character or stratagem was way overperforming because of a weapon rule, that one weapon could have its points increased to compensate. If demo charges on acolytes are a problem, but hand flamers are not, rather than increasing the cost of the unit, a Genestealer Cult acolyte unit could have the points per demo charge increased. So anyone who was running the unit with just hand flamers isn't penalised for something that they weren't doing anyway. And there are lots of easy to use apps that calculate the points that we did not have at the turn of the millennium in 3rd edition. And it becomes very easy to adapt to the constant Games Workshop balance patches. If your army went up by 30 points, remove one model with a heavy weapon and you are back within the points limit and your army works the same way. When talking to Mark about his Deathwatch LVO victory, he said that if the points changed on anything, the army stops working. It's a puzzle piece that has exactly the right bits to work, and if the points change so you can't have something, that means you lose the entire unit and need to get a different unit, in which case the army list is no longer doing what it was before, isn't anywhere near as good, no longer viable, and you have to make a whole new list. Granular points would fix that, but there are so many drawbacks to having such granular points like we used to have. The meta does pervade, so units are either fully tooled up if they are damage dealers, or they have nothing. Every Battle Sister squad running that wasn't bolters only was a poor use of points. There is still that feeling of building the unit wrong, but at least it was quick to roll in the shooting phase. So this leads to Horde armies across the board with low points. Say it is currently 100 points for 10 Sisters and all weapons right now. But if the squad goes to 80 points for 10 as the minimum and maximum size, but the cost of weapons like a multi-melter and a melter gun and a plasma pistol would bring the unit to 100 points, you see 80 point Sisters with bolt guns only. More models on the table leads to it feeling more crowded than it already is, and those Sisters don't seem like Battle Sisters. They are so generic. There is no special weapon that the unit would have in the lore. And are we really saving enough points by not taking equipment to have another unit and make a game impact? You might see another small unit of Battle Sisters following behind that Battle Sister unit, equally unable to do any damage to the enemy, but still hold objectives to win the games. That is the kind of army list we saw a lot in 9th edition. Though 9th edition had more rules for actions, you had to be a unit of at least 5, and you had to be infantry to complete an action, so there was vast numbers of these small units with no upgrades whatsoever, just hanging around, completing secondary missions, not otherwise interacting with the game. If you're playing a skirmish game like Mordheim, like Battletech, where there's only a few models, then tinkering to a granular points level is fine, but in a war game with 100 models per side, it can be too much. So people default to the meta advice. It gives a clear, this is the best way to run this unit. That may change in 3 months or next edition, and then you feel cheated because you didn't build your Battle Sister squad with a heavy bolter, which has suddenly become 1 point as an upgrade, so you might as well have it. You still have bolters only. This is something that has already happened if you built your unit in like 7th edition in a min-max style. And we're talking about granularity for only some factions. It is not great balance for factions that don't have choices. The Necrons have very few weapon choices and don't have squad leaders. Do you want Tesla or Gauss on your Immortals? That is the option. They're gonna cost the same. For Eldar Aspect Warriors, the Exarch weapon is the only choice. However, other factions like Guard and Space Marines, they have it all. Alien factions don't get many benefits. List building will now take much longer. You can't just say, hey, my opponent didn't turn up, I see that yours didn't either, I have this many points, can you make an army list of that level? It's gonna then take 20 minutes to go through, oh okay, I need a list that works, oh I need to make sure I check with all the weapons that are on the models, hang on, give me some time, and then you get to play half a wargame. Points can still be unbalanced. Okay, points will never balance 40k. It will be potentially more balanced, but it could still end up very imbalanced. Some of the editions of the past had points per weapon per unit, so a grenade launcher in a conscript squad hitting on a 5+ had different points to one hitting on a 3+ in a Kazakin squad. Other editions had a flat value of 10 points for a multi-melter, but if you had to stay still to fire it, unless you were a vehicle, it is now worth way more than 10 points on a vehicle and not worth taking on an infantry squad. I did swap out a multi-melter for a regular bolt gun in a tactical squad. Now we have way more dials for Games Workshop to turn, even more to balance than unit points. And their teams handle that workload? Can the app team implement it correctly? They seem to have been struggling quite a bit with many of the previous options, such as on the Deathwatch Veterans. And I don't know if they've fixed the final day detachment yet to have all of the options you can take as Tyranid allies. This is without points as a thing they need to also figure out. The same people are going to be in charge of points whether it's per unit or per model. It's up to you to decide if they do a good job already of managing points. And you get the occasional rules problem. Cull the Horde secondary mission. They had to clarify that 19 models at the same cost as 20 models is counted as 20 models for the purposes of that secondary. A secondary mission that doesn't work if there are points per model. Or maybe this one secondary should be scrapped. I would like that. It's not a great secondary mission. Points per weapon and points per model is how most editions of 40k have been. But there was a different way of doing things at the end of 9th edition. Not every faction got it, and it felt very much like a Space Marine only element. You paid points per model with a minimum and maximum size for each unit, but almost all war gear was free. Only a few weapons cost more points. So for a few months, every Space Marine unit had a Thunderhammer on their sergeant and were tooled up to the eyeballs. Adeptus Sororitas did not get this. Our weapons still had granular points for just about everything. It was a buff to the Space Marines. But if it was applied across all factions, could it work to have it this way? Almost all of it is free, but there is some granularity for outlier weapons. This is a balance. This is some micromanagement, but not a lot to keep track of. Your army list points would change a little, about as much as they do in the average balance patch. I said average. We're not thinking about the last one the Battle Sisters had. Adeptus Sororitas taking a big kicking from a balance patch is not something new to 10th edition. But this style of points could be implemented within this edition and cause very little upset. Some of the weapons that are obviously better than others can cost points. Swapping a Deathwatch Sergeant's power sword for a Xenophase blade costs 5 points, as it is clearly the better profile. Or it could cost fewer points, 3 points, because it's an upgrade. On a minor difference like a las pistol to a bolt pistol, that barely matters, so that didn't cost points for the 1 extra strength on a short range weapon. But a plasma pistol on the command squad, that costs 5 points over a las pistol. If you didn't put sponsons on your Lehman Russ because you like World War II style tanks over World War I tanks, you could represent that with a cheaper tank. You still get the lore accurate versions, not just the Lehman Russ. You can still have special weapons, as the lore suggests, but you avoid the extreme min-maxing of special weapons and heavy weapons. You won't see all las guns in a guard squad, but may see some different special weapons, some flamers, some grenade launchers, and not plasma guns and melter guns, because presumably those would be the two that cost additional points. And we could do points per model. Have a minimum size and initial cost, then a cost per extra model up to the maximum. If you have 2 lots of 3 Arcoflagellant models because they used to be sold like that, then you won't be forced to take them as 2 units of 3 and could do a squad of 6, as that is between the minimum of 3 and the maximum of 10. And you wouldn't be paying the same points as for a unit of 10. It would actually cost the equivalent of 6 models. Points per model fixes an issue that the Plague Marines had at the start of 10th edition. They were sold in boxes of 7, with points values for units of 5 or units of 10. However, they have also been available in sets of 3. The big drawback is it relies on Games Workshop to balance weapons to our satisfaction, and you may not be happy with how they are balancing points generally. In 9th edition, when they did this, an Imperial Guard squad's mortar and heavy bolter cost the same as a las cannon, and most people will want the las cannon. They weren't given different points. Maybe that one example doesn't matter, but it can lead to a solved or clearly best war gear, but in a different way to the other options of doing points. You wouldn't take a multi-melter on a tactical squad if it will cost more points, but you take the free missile launcher as the best option that doesn't cost additional points. If the points don't go deep enough into a unit's options, like the Battle Sister squad, are we going to charge points for a heavy flamer, or are we not? Is it going to be the best option to have a flamer and a stormbolter at no additional cost? But at least that feels more interesting than all bolt guns. Not every army is Primaris Space Marines. Will points per weapon matter when the witches don't have their shards in their whippy swords? If an option isn't represented for an alien faction, it doesn't matter how you do points. They don't get their weapon. What would we do about different datasheets? Do we recombine the Genestealer Cult Acolytes and the Tau battlesuits? Or do we keep them separate with different special rules? It all depends on how Games Workshop would implement this. There is an ideal version, but your ideal version may not be the same as the amorphous blob head next to you. This is the version I expect Games Workshop to implement. We don't know how soon. It could be later in 10th edition or in 11th edition. But this is what they were discussing in an interview that they were willing to put out online for people to see, though with a paywall to see it. If you want to be part of the amorphous blob that helped me in this conversation and making this video, this topic was a community request and a community poll with results I was not expecting. But going into the details of it, this version may now be my favourite way to do it. With the amount of people who commented about wanting the very granular points of the past, I was not expecting that to poll the lowest. Now that it is a video with pros and cons laid out, what do you think? Which of the 3 versions do you think is best? Or do you want something completely different? If you don't want something completely different, why don't you hear me talk about points a bit more? And points can get real crazy in 40k 10th edition. Have a great day of 40k. Will this finally balance Warhammer 40,000? Will this finally balance Warhammer 40,000?